Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cult of Domesticity, an online professional development seminar made possible by a grant from the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation and sponsored by the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this morning's session. Before we get underway, let me introduce the National Humanities Center to you. We are located in Research Triangle Park. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. Let me unpack that for you. That's kind of a mouthful. First of all, we're an independent organization. That means we're a private nonprofit entity. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that we run a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the Humanities Center for an academic year to research and write books and articles on topics in the humanities, subjects like history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We opened in 1978, and since then we've had about 1,100 scholars here, and they have produced about 1,200 books. Now that may make the place sound like an ivory tower, and from these pictures you can see that it looks like an ivory tower. We even have a spiral staircase going right up through the middle of the building, but it's not an ivory tower. The founders wanted to connect with a wide array of people, and they were particularly interested in connecting with teachers. And we do that in three ways. Our online seminars, which you've discovered. And I want to point out that we offer online seminars all year long. Please go to our website and check out our 2011-12 schedule. You'll find some really interesting topics, seminars conducted by major scholars. These do not carry a stipend, and they do ask for a modest $35 registration fee. But I think you'll find that they're very worthwhile. In addition, we also offer Teacher Serve, which is a collection of what we call instructional guides. These are secondary essays written by leading scholars. We have three guides, one on religion in American history, another on the environment in American history, and finally a third one on teaching African American literature and history. We also offer a collection of teaching anthologies, which we call our Toolbox Library. These are collections of primary sources, historical documents, literary texts, images, and audio material. We've organized them for you thematically within chronological frames, and they're illuminated by extensive notes and interpretive questions, and they're really excellent for classroom instruction. So please take a look at those. If you want to find out what's going on in the National Humanities Center's education programs, become a friend on our Facebook page. That way you'll get bulletins about every new product that we put out there. Now let me tell you a little bit about this seminar. The recording and the recording of the seminar and its presentation will be available after the seminar on the website that you use to access your texts. On this website, you will also find an evaluation form. Please fill that out for us and submit it to us. You can do that online. These are very important to us. We pay attention to them. And furthermore, you will not get your $100 stipend unless we get your evaluation form. Now, how the seminar is going to work. This will be a lecture and discussion seminar keyed to presentations of slides with text excerpts that illustrate important points. We really urge you to participate with questions and comments and responses to the discussion questions. And we want to point out that our PowerPoint presentation we offer to you as a potential instructional tool for your teaching. Feel free to plunder it and use the material in your classes. Now, how do you participate? Well, for those of you who are new, let me explain. If you want to click in and talk, there's a little hand raised icon right there. Click on that. I'll see that hand up next to your name, and I will pass the microphone to you. When your microphone icon to the right of your name is red, that means your microphone is turned off. When it goes gray, it means it's turned on. If you rather chat, and most people do, put your cursor down here in the chat box, type your chat message, and click the send button. Then your chat message will appear in the larger box above. And I will be following all that and reading those chat messages and bringing them into the conversation as we proceed. Now, as I mentioned earlier, once we receive your evaluation, we will send you a stipend check for $100. Now, if you've participated in any other of our seminars this summer, you will still get only one stipend check of $100. We offer three, but if you participate in any one of them, you are eligible for the stipend. You'll also receive from us documentation of participation, which will be a letter that you'll be able to take to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit your participation in this seminar warrants. Okay, so are there any questions? Are we ready to move forward? If we're ready to go, click on that yellow smiley-faced icon just above the chat box. Let me know if you're ready. Okay, I'm seeing some of them coming through now. Great. Well, it appears that people are ready to go. So let's get underway with our seminar on the cult of domesticity. We have 3 goals this morning. We want to deepen your understanding of the 19th century cult of domesticity. We want to explore how the cult both oppressed and empowered women, and we want to provide new material and ideas to strengthen your teaching. Now, we had a pretty good discussion on the seminar forum, and let me bring some of those issues in here now. One person wrote that in many portrayals of women, it seems that a woman's life ends as she yields to either the will of a man or the love for a man. Is this true in literature within the domestic tradition? Some of you said that students cannot imagine women's roles different from those they see today. So how can we get students to understand that the cult of domesticity, that these roles have changed or not changed over time? That'll be an interesting discussion in the seminar. How did adherence to the cult of domesticity affect women psychologically? To what extent was the cult of domesticity based on class and race? And does the cult of domesticity influence women's lives in the 21st century? We have established some framing questions for the seminar. How are the 4 cardinal virtues of the cult of true womanhood, piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, either exhibited, challenged, or both in our readings on domesticity? What are some of the potential political and economic consequences of encouraging women to restrict themselves to the domestic sphere of home and hearth? And finally, was domesticity a fair price that women paid for security in mid-19th century America? What would enter into a true cost analysis of the benefits and risks? To lead us through those questions, we're very pleased to have with us this morning Lucinda MacKethan, Professor Emerita of English at North Carolina State University and a Fellow of the National Humanities Center. You see Cindy's publications right there, and while you're pondering those, let me make her the host and presenter in the seminar, turn things over to her. Cindy, you are now in charge of the board, so take it away. It's all yours.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me, and I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm going to try to move this thing along. If you'll go to the next page, here is a website that I just want to mention to you that is a response to your forum talk about updating the idea of the cult of domesticity, which also uses a lot of images. I won't go through it now, but take a look at it. It'll be available on your forum after this, and it's got great images and also a good discussion of how far into the 20th century the cult of domesticity has gone. And then, of course, what we might want to consider is how far into the 21st century might the cult of domesticity be going. So please mark this wonderful website, and we can maybe keep a discussion going later on.
Yeah, let me point out to you that website, you needn't worry about getting the URL for that website right off the screen, because it is posted on the seminar forum. So after the seminar, if you want to go to that website, just go back to the forum that you used to begin the discussion and introduce yourselves. And on that forum, you will find the URL, and it'll take you right to the website Cindy just described.
Okay, thanks, Richard. We're going to begin not with a definition, but with working toward a definition of what has been labeled the cult of domesticity. And we're going to try to find a way to do this through the newest incarnation of the National Humanities Center as a drama center, as Richard and I do a play based on a short sketch by the very well-known and popular 19th century writer Sarah Parton, better known as Fanny Fern. So here we go. And as you listen to us, I hope you'll kind of start thinking and chatting about what characteristics of the cult of domesticity you might see that will help us create a working definition. So here goes.
Dear Mary, I have a favor to ask of you. You have a friend whom I dislike very much, and who I am quite sure will make trouble between us. Will you give up Mrs. May for my sake, Mary?" A slight shade of vexation crossed Mary's pretty face as she said,
"You are unreasonable, Harry. She is ladylike, refined, intellectual, and fascinating, is she not?"
"Yes, all of that. And for that very reason, her influence over one so yielding and impulsive as yourself is more to be dreaded, if unfavorable. I'm quite in earnest, Mary. I wish you never to see her." I blew my lines. "Mary, I wish never to see you together again."
"Oh, sure, dear Harry, that's going too far. Don't be disagreeable. Let's talk of something else. As old Uncle Jeff says, how's trade?" And she looked archly in his face.
I'm not smiling here. I want to tell you, I'm really not smiling. Shall we go on then?
"I think we'd better." "Well," said the little wife, turning away and patting her foot nervously, "I don't see how I can break with her, Harry, for a whim of yours. Besides, I've promised to go there this very evening."
I'm making no reply, and I'm leaving to go to the office.
And I stood behind the curtain and looked after him as he went down the street. There was a very uncomfortable sensation in my throat and something like a tear glittering in my eye. Henry was vexed, I was sure of that, and so I wandered, restless and unhappy, into my little sleeping room. And turn where I would, some proof of his devotion met my eye. But Mrs. May, she was so smart and satirical. She would make so much sport of her for being ruled so by Harry. No, it wouldn't do for her to yield. Yes, she would go. She'd made up her mind. And then she opened her jewel case, and a little note fell at her feet. She knew the contents very well. It was from Harry, slipped slyly into her hand on her birthday with a pretty bracelet. It couldn't do any harm to read it again. It was very lover-like for a year-old husband beau, but she liked it. Perhaps, after all, Harry was right about Mrs. May, and if he wasn't, well, one hair of his head was worth more to her than all the women in the world. He'd never said one unkind word to her, never. He'd anticipated every wish. She'd been so attentive and solicitous when she was ill. How could she grieve him? Love conquered. The pretty robe was folded away. The jewels returned to their case. With a light heart, Mary sat down to wait her husband's return.
God bless you, Mary. You've saved me from a keen sorrow.
Dear reader, won't you tell? There are some husbands worth all the sacrifices a loving heart can make. And our question, based on this story, what attributes might you say characterize the cult of domesticity?
Okay, so we put that question out there. What attributes characterize the cults of domesticity based on Fanny Fern's little story? Well, if you were going to make a definition of that, submissiveness, submission to the husband. Oh, we got a lot of submission. Women are inferior. First wears the wife all day. Submission. That seems to be the one that's carrying today. Guilt. Let's see. Anything else?
Not I like being, where is the woman all day?
Yeah. Men. Oh, wow, we're getting a lot of them here. Men are afraid of smart intellectual influences in their wives. Staying at home. Don't be a tinker. The husband knows best. Husband has all the power. The need to be taken care of. Oh, yeah. Women need to be led by men. They simply cannot handle things for themselves. Positive traits of women include beauty and sentimentality. Yeah. Husband doesn't want a wife to have a mind of her own. Notice that when her pretty face turns arch, the husband is upset. Fear enters into this too. Receiving gifts, yeah. Lots of really good responses. I would love to hear what a man thinks of this too. Okay, guys, come on, get in there. Let's hear some opinions from them. The wife did try to divert her husband to get her own way.
And I would say here that the funny little thing she puts in there is that she tries to divert him by asking him about trade. How's trade?
Yeah.
To get him into his world, but it doesn't work.
Yeah, as another participant here points out, she never actually did say no. And she wasn't direct with him with what she wanted. Yeah, very indirect.
That would be part of passivity, which would be expected of her.
Yeah. Okay, Cindy, so curiously, I'm not sure that any men registered for this seminar. Well, maybe not. Okay.
I know we had one at one time, but that in itself is something we could talk about. But we've got you, Richard. So
there you go. There you go. Okay, Cindy, what do you make of all these suggestions, putting together a definition here?
Well, all of them certainly are absolutely right on in terms of what this cult of domesticity involved. And I wanted to add two other quotations to our mix before we actually come up with the definition. And I wanted to start by looking at two quotations that I hope are on your screen right now, and get you to guess when they were written and maybe even who wrote them. The first one reads, columns, books, and articles by experts told women their role was to seek fulfillment as wives and mothers. They were taught to pity the neurotic, unfeminine, unhappy women who wanted to be poets or physicists or presidents. They learned that truly feminine women do not want careers, higher education, political rights. 1,000 expert voices applauded their femininity, their adjustment, their new maturity. All they had to do was devote their lives from earliest girlhood to finding a husband and bearing children. And the question I'd like to ask more than who wrote it was, what time is being talked about in this quotation?
Okay, we have some suggestions. Kristen Thomas, here's echoes of Virginia Woolf. Robin Girardi wonders if it's Betty Friedan. I've been reading too much Jane Austen lately, another one writes. These both look like they could be from her. Robin thinks it's come from the 60s, Jennifer from the 50s. The first reads a lot like 1960s Cult of True Womanhood. So we're getting the opinion here. Could be from the 50s, 60s, and it could be Betty Friedan.
Okay.
We give this away on the next slide, Lucinda.
Yeah.
Do you want to read the next quote?
Yeah, let's just read the next quote on the same page. We now see women in that sphere for which she was originally intended and which she so exactly fitted to adorn and bless, as the wife, the mistress of the home, the solace, the aid, and the counselor of the one for whose sake alone the world is of any consequence to her.
Okay. When do we think that one was written, the second quote? And in the meantime, your quotes here have reminded Sharetta of the situation today at Hillary Clinton and Mrs. Weiner, all of the women who have been in the news lately due to the infidelity of their husbands. Okay, now we're getting some suggestions here about the second quote. Katharine Beecher, Maria Shriver. Well, that's a stretch. Any other? What about the time? When do you think the second quote was written? We had the 1950s and 60s for the first. Suggest some possible dates for the second quote. Any takers on that? Okay, nobody seems to want to venture a guess when this 2000. Okay, people are unsure. 2000, 1950s as well. This is a trick. Somebody's got our game here. All right, yeah. 1840, 1974. Okay, we're getting all. So there's one 19th century suggestion and some, again, 1960s, some 20th century, maybe in 21st, 1820s. Okay, shall we reveal our secret, Cindy? On to the next slide?
I think we should. You were right about the first one, those of you who said Betty Friedan. I remember being given this book when I was a freshman in college in 1963. And my college was never the same after they let us women read that book for our freshman book. I can tell you that. A really important book. And it was talking, of course, not about the 1840s and 50s, but about the 1940s and 50s, as Betty Friedan used mainly magazines, advertisements, as well as popular literature to formulate this message that she felt was being sent to women, and she named that message the feminine mystique. Now, the second quotation by George Washington Burnup, he was a Unitarian minister, and this was from one of his essays. He was very popular, called The Sphere and Duties of Women, and that shows you that very early on, this image of the sphere as in separate spheres or women in the private sphere, was an image that was known and thought about at that time. As we think about the image of the sphere, and you with your students might think of what that encircling of women in this sphere would cause. And you might also think that did men really have a sphere, or were women inside a circle and men free to roam without a sphere at all? But these two quotations I would suggest you might use to let your students come up with their own definition using the language of these quotations that are more than 100 years apart, but describe something very interesting to contemplate about American culture.
We have an interesting question here from Kelly Hansen about satire and irony. Was Friedan, when she wrote this, was there any irony implied in here at all, or was she writing this straight?
She was writing it straight.
Uh-huh.
She was. I think her submerged irony is about the approach of men, 1,000 expert voices. I don't think she's being ironic about that, yeah. except in her own dismay with that.
And then we have another interesting comment here from Kristen Thomas. She writes that it's interesting that Burnham focuses on the one in capital letters and doesn't really account for children. So this really, really does revolve around the husband, does it not?
Well, and the funny thing was, when I first read it, I thought surely he must be talking about God. And then I looked more closely, and no, he's talking about the husband, not God. But to make the husband the one does seem like an extreme statement, but I think we have some other comments from other observers of 19th century middle class women that echo this very point, that she lived for her husband in the realm of his home.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and to clarify a point here that Linda Evans raises, Burnett didn't originate this. He was among several commentators in the 19th century who spoke about women's sphere, the sphere of domesticity, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can find hundreds of them. That's the whole point. Of course, when we move on to where Barbara Welter formulates the exact term, the cult of true womanhood or domesticity, we see that she took Betty Friedan, actually was a great admirer of Betty Friedan, and she looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these statements to come up with her idea of what the cult of domesticity is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, there's some discussion in the comment between whether the one refers to God or the husband, and certainly if we go back to Fanny Fern's piece, I mean, it does really seem to be the husband, as you were saying.
I think it. I don't think it's God, as surprising as that is, because she's to be his counselor, you see.
Yeah, well, that's true.
And the world is only of consequence to her in relationship to him. And we can move on, and I'll let you see some other some other statements that will show that this is exactly what he meant. But we might take a break here to look instead of read, and take a look at this image, a very popular image from Godey's Ladies book. And what I'd like you to do is brainstorm and share, what do you see in this picture? Just what do you see?
All right. What do we see? How does the image illustrate the cult of domesticity? It'd be a good image to use, I think, with your students. Okay.
Any takers?
We have some children. Okay, a mother, a woman in her element, a Don Quixote in the background, the kids, women and children. Mothers raise the children are already accomplished. Okay, women's work. Let's see. Home, family, mother, the center, women in charge of the house and kids, child care, a happy puppy, motherhood. Mother is in her throne. That's a good way to look at the chair.
Yes, that is a nice, yeah.
Dishes, no dishes, no cooking, no laundry.
Which brings up, of course, the class issue that we'll think about. And as you think about class, you might just think about the clothing. Can you say things about class just from the illustration, about which American class gets to participate in this cult?
Yeah. Father's in the back farming. I'm not sure about that. Nevertheless, is middle class. There's no husband around. Well cared for family. Upper middle class, we're saying here.
Yes,
You know,
probably so.
yeah.
And look, notice how the boy is already leaning protectively over the girl. And they are reading. She will be in charge of education, and books are very important to the cult of domesticity, both as ways to get across the doctrine and as being increasingly framed as something women do. Women read books, men don't.
Yeah. All right. We have Heather notes that the dog is loyal to the male. We have a question about who's on the horse, and we may want to talk about that. It's a very small world. What about that thing, the sort of triangular thing to the right of the boy?
I cannot figure out is that a kite? I don't know what, or is it? I've been wondering myself. I hope someone has an idea.
I don't know. It could be a kite. It also looks shield-like. I really don't know, but it's
weird.
It seems to be associated with the boy, and the young girl is taking care of her brother, being taught to take care of the mother. Yeah, has got the brother there. We may want to talk also about the horseman and the windmill. And what realm that would belong to. I think it's kind. Okay. Mary notes that it's probably Don Quixote, and we have Ellen noting that may be a warrior shield.
I thought that, I first thought how the father isn't there, but the warrior is, so that it was a kind of a minor image of the father that was kept at home. And then you see that windmill and you think, well, now if this is Don Quixote, that's a very interesting little irony that I don't know whether was intended or not about man as warrior, because we know Don Quixote was not exactly the most effective warrior out there.
Well, it's an allusion, as Elizabeth Harvey notes, it's an allusion to chivalry, and also I think it suggests a venturing forth, a going out into the world, and it is on the right side of the picture. Seems to be associated with the boy in some way.
Yeah, I think so, and I love these comments about men. Men have to go out and fight windmills while women are staying in this very sheltered space, including the curtains. I think that's an interesting point. But I also love the little irony of trying to keep women down is fighting at windmills. In the long run, it'll take a while.
Okay.
All right. We have all of these, and again, for your students, you might get them to brainstorm, come up with adjectives that in describing this picture might describe the qualities of domesticity, as well as the drawbacks, as well as the ironies, and as well as some of the ambivalence or ambiguity about domesticity. I think it might be a good image to brainstorm with students. Okay. We're ready, at least for the woman who actually created the definition and the description and the terminology of what we now today call the cult of true womanhood. Barbara Welter, who wrote her influential essay in 1966, was, again, using Friedan's very important methodology in collecting materials with which to frame her definition. And she's best known, and the essay is best known for the 4 words that she used most prominently to describe 4 aspects of the ideology or cult. First of all, let me say a word about the word cult, which I think is interesting. And I don't know this for sure, but Barbara Welter herself said that a different word for cult might have been mystique. I think she didn't want to use the word mystique of true womanhood or mystique of domesticity, maybe in part because Friedan had already used it. But using the word cult, well, perhaps you'd like to tell me a little bit about what does that do to us as we study this ideology. What does the word cult?
Okay, Marcella suggests brainwashing.
I think that's possible.
Makes it sound like as if we're under a spell.
Yes, I think that certainly was something she was interested in.
Okay, conveys negative connotations.
Yes,
Unwavering allegiance, cult following, I mean, the popular viewpoint, religious overtones.
yes, and I
Again,
think that's important, the
yeah, a
religious
note,
overtones.
negative. We don't have expectations for men. There doesn't seem to be well, there may be cults for men. I don't know. Yeah, people are
Oh, I think
commenting
so. Yeah,
on
I think there are cults for
control.
men, and of course, I think
Yeah,
we want to emphasize that this was a cult for men as well as women,
right.
in its obverse reactions at any rate. So yes, cult is certainly derogatory, but also I think has that religious emphasis. There is and there is also something perhaps mystical and psychological about it, certainly beyond the political or social realms. Um, and as a cult, let's take a look now at the 4 qualities of this cult that Welter identified. The first one was related to religion, and not surprising, that women, unlike men, had a religious habit of mind and spirit, and that they would enact this spirit through service to others, suffering, very important. They were expected to suffer. And also, perhaps most importantly, the one thing they did better than men was uphold Christian morality and teach it from the home. Purity, I think, is very interesting to consider with students. Really does mean sexually virtuous. Purity has to do with the body and how it is presented, and how women in all relations with the opposite sex are demure, are chaste, are virginal until the minute they marry. Do we have a hand that we want to stop at here?
No, I think someone else just joined us, so we can go
okay. On. Okay. Submissiveness, we understand that, not just obedience, but also I would say passivity. Passivity, you don't ever assert yourself. I think when you talked about Mary as being indirect with her husband and Fanny Fern's, she's not going to directly challenge him. She challenges him a little bit more than we might expect from within her home. But she's all about indirectness and maybe passive aggression as well. And then the fourth, the term that really overtook true womanhood in Welter's definition, is simply the quality of domesticity. And that means being a good housekeeper, not just making it clean, but making the home absolutely sacred as a space, which also means that she is not frivolous, but she is also doesn't try to be her husband's intellectual equal in any way. She's his moral superior, but she is not his intellectual or physical equal, and she accepts that as part of what domesticity means. So that is Welter's description of what we call the cult, but we could also, and it might help students to call it a mystique or an ideology, or even simply an ideal of womanhood.
Marcella Moon has taken an interesting point of view on this. She's looking at it sort of from the outside, and she's asking, did the cult imply that the outside world was evil and dangerous, even for men?
Yes, indeed. It is dangerous, and it's way too dangerous for women, and it corrupts men. But somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to go out there, and men, because they have been trained and taught by their mothers what true morality is, can go out in that world and make it work. And there's an interesting analogy that women is to the home as man is to the state. So it is his job out there in the world to do for the state, for the nation, what the woman is going to do for the home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have an interesting comment here about how women are the people who maintain Christian morality, but they're not in a position to preach it. Again, emphasizing that sense of inferiority and submissiveness.
That's true, and not taking up the public space, not going out and giving speeches, etc., is very important to this. And of course, remember the shadow that is rising behind the cult of domesticity is Seneca Falls and the whole women's rights movement, which we have to say failed in being able to do almost any of what it wanted to do in the same time period, and probably largely because this cult was incredibly deeply entrenched, not certainly across the board, but those who had the cult of domesticity is going to trump women's rights until certainly after the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. And then one of our forum questions about does the cult of domesticity influence women's lives in the 21st century, Linda Evans makes the point here that we may have a different kind of cult in the 21st century, the having it all. Work, marriage, children, family care, and handling it all without problem or complaint. So perhaps there's a new cult of true womanhood out there.
Yes, I think that's very, very important. And I think if you had your students analyze current magazines, that's what they would see. Women do it all now. I also, of course, want to talk a little bit about what Marcella Moon is mentioning, and that is abolition as also the other backdrop of the cult of domesticity. Which in some ways, of course, the cult of domesticity, like the women's rights movement, it grows a little bit out of the abolition movement because for some women, it showed that they could enter the public sphere from home. Now, of course, a lot of women wanted to get out and speak, but women could also, from the home, begin to have the kind of effect on the anti-slavery movement from within their homes that might have given them a sense of power.
Judith Batten asks, to what extent did the slavery issue override the women's movement prior to the Civil War?
Well, of course, some of you historians probably know that as well as I do, but certainly abolition overshadowed the women's rights movement, and there were certainly most of the leaders, Stanton and Lucretia Mott, etc., were involved in both of them, but their own husbands found it much easier to support anti-slavery than they did the denial of freedom, if you will, for women within their own homes. That was not a concept that received mainstream interest until a long time later.
Okay. Well, we've got about an hour left, Cindy.
Okay. I wanted to back up Barbara Welter a little bit by looking not at the things she looked at most closely, and that is the popular writings and expressions of Americans, but as of people who we might think were more objective, or at least looking at American women from the outside. When we do this with 4 writers who came to America and looked at women during this time, not really from the inside, we see some confirmation of what she found with others. Now, James Fenimore Cooper, of course, was an American, but he saw himself as marginally American, really. He wrote about America as an outsider in the 1930s before he wrote his own very masculine books. And in his comment, there's some interesting things about it. And one of the things that struck me, and I hope you'll join in, is when he says there is perhaps something in the security of matrimony that is not very propitious to female blandishments. He's talking about the fact that when an American girl marries, she very happily gives up her attendance at parties or her interest in anything else, but what she gains is a huge word for domesticity. Domesticity as a cult, the word security. And I think we need to think about why women bought into this. That word security of matrimony is a huge part of why women accepted this cult. And yes, financial security, social security in a different way. An unmarried woman, an old maid was a terrible thing to have to be. There was no place for them when the nuclear family becomes the important social unit in our society. So this is James Fenimore Cooper. Then we have a wonderful woman, Frances Trollope, whose husband, Anthony, was a great novelist, but also a financial trial to her. And she came to America and wrote a book about it. And again, an interesting comment from her, what she noticed from ladies, this is her upper middle class American women whom she visited, that they had no money entrusted to them. She recalls seeing them out shopping. Never did they use their own money. They always said, send a bill home and my husband will give you a draft. So this was just an everyday occurrence that she became very aware of. Next is the wonderful Alex de Tocqueville, who wrote about Americans. Very funny man, but also very sharp-witted. And what he noticed was that young ladies might enjoy some freedom, but when a woman marries, it's as if she entered a convent, except that it's not taken ill that she had children, and even many of them. The life of again, we're talking about middle-class white women, was the life of a nun. No more balls, no more society. And when he asked a woman how she wanted to spend her day, she said, and he said, this is no joke. She wanted to spend it in admiring her husband. I can't believe that he's not exaggerating. Can you? It was in that. But at any rate, he's picking up again on something that was as surprising as it might look or silly to us, was simply the way that this world was beginning more and more to operate. And the last one is Gustave de Beaumont, another Frenchman who noticed very early on, 1831, and notice his last statement. In the United States, a woman ceases to be free on the day when in France she becomes so. And that word freedom, of course, it was a big word in 1831 because that's when the first abolitionist society was created in Boston. But he's applying it to all American women, the issue of her loss of freedom when she becomes a wife. So I'd love to see your responses to these four outsider opinions. Again, they just show us how pervasive some of the aspects of the cult of domesticity were in the mid-19th century in America.
Sydney, Megan Glenn makes an interesting point here. She talks about how most women at this point lived agrarian lives, which required both men and women to work in the field. Would it be fair to say that the cult of domesticity was pretty much an urban phenomenon, or would class even determine how it operated in agrarian areas?
Well, I think it spread out from the cities to a certain degree, but it had to be a pretty much urban phenomenon. Again, it was also a phenomenon of a literate culture and a print culture. Mm-hmm. I think it would be important to stress that the cult of domesticity was a carefully and extensively marketed idea, and that because of that, of course, it was tied most closely to centers where women had leisure to read, where women had money to buy these extensive magazines and handbooks and sometimes even novels. You do also see it in sermons, and a lot of sermons that would be moving out from the cities to agrarian areas. And I think the way it was marketed was, okay, you women who are wives of farmers, don't you wish you could live like this? Mm-hmm. But it very seldom, of course, could include them because of a very different lifestyle that they had to be involved in. But of course, the movement away from the farm and toward a much more industrial, urbanized America, that's what else is happening between 1820 and 1860 in America. And as that shift takes place, you have to wonder, part of the reason that shift takes place is that men are moving to the cities and taking over what we call heavy lifting. And why would not women prefer that to getting up to milk the cow?
Right, and Robin notes here, she brings the South into the equation. Of course, now if you were living on a farm and you had slaves, it would strike me that the South would be more hospitable. A certain class of women in the South would find the cult of domesticity more comfortable. Would that be the case?
Oh, certainly. And I wanted to point out one very interesting change in vocabulary. In the in the 18th century, slavery was often referred to as the patriarchal institution. By the 1830s, Southern pro-slavery advocates were saying that slavery is a domestic institution. And that change in wording from patriarchal to domesticity, again, is a marketing ploy in the South to try to present the Southern plantation as a domestic arrangement where slaves are happy children and their masters and their mistresses spend all their lives looking after them. So in the South, domesticity obtained much longer women's rights. White plantation women had fewer rights to anything. The dower rights that they had, their inability to hold property, this lasted much longer for white women in the South than it did in the North. So certainly, yes, domesticity was very popular among slave-holding women in the South.
Okay, so to address one of the questions from the forum, to what extent was the cult of domesticity based on class and race? It was based very much on class, and of course the cult of domesticity was beyond the pale for African American women.
Yes, you find a few instances before the Civil War of free black families who had lived in places like Philadelphia and Boston and New York for generations, and you see some admission into the middle class where some of the same creeds obtain. You find this, for instance, among some young black women who wanted to go south after the Civil War to help the freedmen, and their own families were appalled that they would leave their class to do this. But for most African Americans, as slaves or even freed people, this cult could only work for them as a vocabulary that they might use themselves, and we're going to talk about that in a little while.
Okay, and I think I think we've addressed another question in the forum, the first one, which participants asked. In many participants of women, it seems that a woman's life ends as she yields to either the will of a man or the love of a man. Is this true in literature within the domestic tradition? And I think the quotes that we just looked at and the Fanny Fern thing would say that yes, that is true within the domestic tradition.
Oh, I think definitely so. So I think we've at least set up how this particular ideology operated and who it seems intended for. And the question, of course, that remains for us to think about, I think, is what did it do? Again, why did women buy into it? What did they get out of it? What did they lose by it? Did the cult of domesticity oppress women or empower them? And of course, this is not an either-or answer. And we might want to think about, how it did something of both as women navigated their way through this kind of media-born movement. So, in order to answer that question, I think we will do another drama for us.
Okay.
Are you ready, Richard?
Go ahead. Why don't you go ahead? You set the scene.
Okay, and here's the scene. And right before this, Mrs. Byrd, husband, who is a politician, a senator, has come home to rest, and she begins a conversation with him about how was your day, dear, and it was very hard, he tells her. And then she asks him about a law she heard was being considered. And then Stowe describes her this way: as a timid, blushing little woman with mild blue eyes and a peach blow complexion and the sweetest voice. Courage, notice that the two animals, a cock turkey could scare her to death, or a stout house dog of moderate capacity. could bring her to subjection, so she doesn't need her husband to do that. Her husband and her children were her entire world, and in these she ruled more by entreaty and persuasion than by command or argument. But there was one thing that could arouse her, and that provocation came in on the side of her gentle and sympathetic nature. Anything in the shape of cruelty threw her into a passion. And so on the present occasion, she stands up when her husband says, oh, yes, we've been dealing with this little inconvenient law about fugitive slaves. And she says, now, John, I want to know if you think such a law as that is right and Christian.
You won't shoot me now, Mary, if I say I do.
I never could have thought of you, John. You didn't vote for it.
Even so, my fair politician.
No, nonsense. I wouldn't give a flip for all your politics generally, but I think this is something downright cruel and unchristian. I hope, my dear, no such law has been passed.
There has been a law passed forbidding people to help off the slaves that come over from Kentucky, my dear. So much of that thing has been done by these reckless abolitionists that our brethren in Kentucky are very strongly excited, and it seems necessary, and no more than Christian and kind, that something should be done by our state to quiet the excitement.
And what is the law? It don't forbid us to shelter those poor creatures a night, does it? And to give them something comfortable to eat and a few old clothes and send them quietly about their business?
Why, yes, my dear. That would be aiding and abetting, you know.
You ought to be ashamed, John. Poor, homeless, houseless creatures. It's a shameful, wicked, abominable law, and I'll break it for one the first time I get a chance. And I hope I shall have a chance. I do. Things have got to a pretty pass if a woman can't give a warm supper and a bed to poor, starving creatures just because they are slaves and have been abused and oppressed all their lives, poor things.
But, Mary, just listen to me. Your feelings are all quite right, dear, and interesting, and I love you for them. But then, dear, we mustn't suffer our feelings to run away with our judgment. You must consider it's a matter of private feeling. There are great public interests involved. There is such a state of public agitation rising that we must put aside our private feelings.
Now, John, I don't know anything about politics, but I can read my Bible, and there I see that I must feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and comfort the desolate. And that Bible I mean to follow.
But in cases where your doing so would involve a great public evil,
obeying God never brings on public evils. I know it can't. It's always safest, all round, to do as He bids us.
Now listen to me, Mary, and I can state to you a very clear argument to show...
Oh, John. Nonsense. You could talk all night, but you wouldn't do it. I put it to you, John. Would you turn away a poor, shivering, hungry creature from your door because he was a runaway? Would you now?
Now, if the truth must be told, our senator had the misfortune to be a man who had a particularly humane and accessible nature, and turning away anybody that was in trouble never had been his forte. And what was worse for him in this particular pinch of the argument was that his wife knew it, and of course was making an assault on rather an indefensible point. So he had recourse to the usual means of gaining time for such cases made, and provided, he said, and coughed several times, took out his pocket handkerchief, and began to wipe his glasses. Mrs. Bird, seeing the defenseless condition of the enemy's territory, had no more conscience than to push her advantage.
I should like to see you doing that, John. I really should. Turning a woman out of doors in a snowstorm, for instance. Or maybe you'd take her up and put her in jail, wouldn't you? You would make a great hand at that. And, of course, almost immediately, there is a knock on the door, and Eliza and little Harry appear looking for shelter in the night.
Okay, we've had a lot of comments while we were acting our play here. I think we got to a lot of people. We should go on the road with this.
Good.
Anyway, let's see. We have here from Leanne Frazier, many women tried to change unfair laws by changing views within the house first. Sheila Thompson notes that her focus is on religion and her husband's focus is on politics, feeling versus logic. She makes him feel like his ideas later on to help the runaway. She speaks of slaves as they are children or pets, feels empathy. It's interesting that in this case, the wife gets her way. Lots of good comments here. What would you like to comment about what if you were going to use this with students, Cindy? What would you have them focus on?
Well, I would have them notice the language for one thing. And also the tone. I would have them notice how Stowe's objective description of Mrs. Bird is belied almost immediately by a very strong, assertive, if not aggressive vocabulary when she begins to talk about this one thing. When she says, "I can't wait for a chance to break this law," this tiny little decorous, timid, scared woman afraid of a dog, it becomes an entirely different person. And I think what we'd like to look at with Stowe is how she never leaves the sphere of domesticity, and yet within it, her little heroine here, her hero, we'd like to call her, becomes a fighter, a politician, a statesman, a speaker, and how that transformation takes place does open up the ball game for us to consider that the cult of domesticity could be used by women as a weapon, not just as a security blanket, and see how that obtained. Because of course, when we know the story of Harriet Beecher Stowe, we know that that's indeed what she did with her novel. Without ever really getting up on a podium, she was able to change a tremendous number of lives by talking in terms of women and children and families, and the great desecration that slavery was to the domestic sphere.
I think we have two comments that are germane here. Linda Evans writes, "The political issues are talked about by a loving couple. He may condescend, but he is listening." And then Megan Glynn points out, "The cult is a source of empowerment for Mrs. Bird."
Yes, it definitely did. Of course, the one little thing I would add about all of this is that the cult of domesticity only works when you have a husband like Senator Bird. And as people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott are going to say, the trouble comes when you don't have a listener, a man who has the misfortune. And I love, if you read Stowe's novel, she is so sarcastic. And she says here, the senator had the misfortune to be a man who had a particularly humane and accessible nature. And of course, her sarcasm there, when she means just the opposite, is in some ways also at the crux of domesticity. It works when you have a good husband. It does not work when you don't have a good husband.
Mm-hmm. And Judith Batten makes a point here, too. Wasn't Harriet Beecher Stowe a different sort of model for women of the time? Couldn't we argue that it works, it empowers women, or at least it empowered Stowe, because Stowe was a writer. I mean, she engaged the world beyond the sphere of domesticity, but she did it in a way that was acceptable for women. She was a writer, and she got published. She had access to the publishing apparatus of her day. Most women didn't, right?
Well, that's true, but she did not take advantage of that until this issue spurred her on. She had not written until Uncle Tom's Cabin. She had been far too busy having children primarily and moving with her minister husband as his own economic problems forced their migration around the Midwest and Northeast. She did not become a writer until the fugitive slave law, as she says, motivated her to do something about this. Now, what she did have, and I'm going to move on to the next quotation, what she did have in her background that most women didn't was a sister with whom she had been a school teacher. And I think maybe that's the more important area to think about is teaching. Women were always able to be teachers and to start schools. It was one of the few economic openings that they could draw upon when they needed money, either as unmarried or married women. And Katharine Beecher became America's foremost women's educator, and her sister, Harriet, worked long and hard with her, and she learned a great deal from her sister, Katharine Beecher, whose most famous book on the subject of women and education was a very popular treatise on domestic economy that she published almost 10 years before Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, the sisters are going to part ways a little bit because Katharine Beecher was a great deal more conservative than Harriet Beecher Stowe. But if you take a look at this quotation from the treatise on domestic economy, what Katharine Beecher says is that women choose to entrust their interests to the other sex. It's worth looking at this more closely. She says that the female sex's rights and interests have been fully developed in the United States. And in this country, women have an equal interest, notice that, an equal interest in all social and civil concerns. And no domestic, civil, or political institution is right which sacrifices her interest to promote that of the other sex. But, and here's that word again, in order to secure her in these privileges, it is decided, notice the passive voice there, that in the domestic relation she take a subordinate station and her interest be entrusted to the other sex. And so this is what is kind of behind Harriet Beecher Stowe. It puts the brakes on her a little bit, but notice, I think, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, she takes this kind of statement and she manipulates it to become an ideology that she can use politically without becoming a politician. Any comments on this treatise and the work of Katharine Beecher? Now, in the same book, she tells people how to clean windows and cook a good dinner and how to work with their maids and get the laundry done and take care of children. So it was, and I love the word domestic economy. That's an important twosome there, isn't it? That this domesticity had its economic value, and maybe that's what it mostly was an economic system.
Well, Robin notes here that this would be a great document to teach alongside the Seneca Falls Declaration, and Sharon Stucker notes that this document tells women how to keep peace of mind around the house. It seems as though women can have opinions, but they cannot act upon them. Many women want a husband who earn more than they do. And Daniela Stamm notes that this would be a good document to contrast with the Seneca Falls Convention.
Yes, I think it would work very well there. I've been reading particularly Elizabeth Cady Stanton's works, and it's interesting to see how she tries to work within the domesticity vocabulary, but to put these two women up against one another would be a wonderful way to let the words do the talking and let students see the differences. Mm-hmm. So instead of secondary sources, I think that would be a great idea.
Yeah, Linda Evans echoes that. She tries to stay within the time period with the reading material, not impose contemporary views, but Katharine Beecher gives her the creeps.
Well, she was an interesting woman. She had to take over being kind of the mother to her famous preacher father's brood when his wives were not able to, never married, but was very powerful in her time. And one of those handbooks for how to be a good woman that we're lucky to have now to use to understand these things. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Megan Glenn asked an interesting question. Is the temperance movement an outlet for women upset with the cult? Would that be it?
Upset with the cult? Well, they wouldn't have said so. They would have said that it gave them their first marketing opportunity. That certainly the temperance movement appears around the same time, and it was such a legitimate cause for women to get involved with because it hit more than slavery even. It hit women in the home, and men couldn't marshal any good argument against it. and so they were able, I think, to gain a little bit of a foothold for themselves and for their confidence and for their sense of themselves as perhaps being reformers within the domestic credo by the temperance movement. Here's a place where domesticity could become, in some ways, empowering, or at least allow women influence. I'm not going to say power, and I think it's an interesting difference. Women could gain influence as reformers through some of these issues, through the domesticity vocabulary. Maybe not power, but certainly influence.
Yeah, and the way temperance was pitched, of course, that it was a direct challenge to domestic life. So they were arguing from their sphere, from within the sphere, sort of.
Yes, yes, and it's it is also interesting to think about temperance as a class issue, because it was one of those things that women knew about all the drunks except for the ones in their own house in a certain class, and so it allowed them again a sense of class superiority. Superiority that was empowering for women, rather sadly, because a lot of women are going to the factories just as these domesticated women are kind of securing themselves against that terrible fate.
Well, the word influence seems to have struck a chord. That's a good way to describe the power derived from the cult of domesticity. All right, shall we move on then?
Yes, I wanted to take a look finally at how a slave woman might use the cult of domesticity in her own behalf and on the behalf of abolition. And so we're looking finally here at a slave narrative by a North Carolina woman, Harriet Jacobs. I think probably most of you know her well as a slave writer and autobiographer. But what I wanted to concentrate now in her autobiography, which was published at the very beginning of the Civil War, but she started writing it in the 1850s, was how she herself, as a writer, after she escaped to the North, could take the vocabulary of the cult of domesticity and use it to create something that could become very important for women across class and race, and that is a sense of bond through a common language, the language of motherhood and the language of nurture, which could also allow them the moral high ground upon which to become very self-assertive. So here we are with, with Harriet Jacobs, whose master has been sexually harassing her, and now she comes to a period in her life when he has told her he's going to build a house for her and move her out to it. Notice her language. I would do anything, everything for the sake of defeating him, she says. So she's very assertive. And then, oh my goodness, then look at the next paragraph as it opens. And now, reader, I come to a period in my unhappy life which I would gladly forget if I could. The remembrance fills me with sorrow and shame, and it pains me to tell you of it. But I promise to tell you the truth, and I will do it honestly, cost me what it made. Again, not quite groveling, but almost humble, submissive, pious. And of course, what she's talking about here is her inability to be pure. But then, notice the last sentence in that little paragraph. I knew what I did, and I did it with deliberate calculation. So she grovels and asks for pity and forgiveness, and then she says, I knew exactly what I was doing. And this incredible shift in tone goes throughout the narrative. Look, oh ye happy women whose purity has been sheltered from childhood. I wanted to keep myself pure. So I became reckless in my despair. That's pure language of the sentimental novels that were, of course, the main fictional literary result of domesticity. And so then she describes how a man in her neighborhood, a white man of some means, took some interest in her, and she chose to have a sexual relationship with him. She is only 15 years old. He's an eloquent gentleman. Alas for the poor slave girl who trusted him. And then, though, notice right after that, alas, of course I saw where this was going. I knew the impassable gulf. But then notice it was to be an object of interest to a man who is not married and not her master is agreeable to pride and feelings of a slave. There is something akin to freedom in having a lover who has no control over you except what he gains by attachment. Does anybody have a comment so far on what we're seeing Harriet Jacobs do?
We've gotten a lot of interesting comments. Earlier on, people noted that she quite deliberately rejected the wife of homemaker. She didn't want that home that he was building for her.
Yes,
That was because the term wife didn't come with it.
Right.
But then Mary notes that sexuality is power, and that comment has elicited a great response. Marcella notes, being outside of the cult, she did have the power to control her sexuality in a way. So within the cult, we didn't talk about how much sexuality was a power within the cult of domesticity, but here she's certainly deploying it to get what she wants, and she can do so because she's outside of it. So let's see here. Another Heather Alexander sees echoes of Kate Chopin's The Awakening.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, particularly that one about deploying sexuality as a tool of power.
Yes, and of course, you aren't going to find any women within the domestic sphere talking about sex because, of course, that would immediately impugn their purity. However, it had to have been a fairly important tool. Let me say, I think of Zora Neale Hurston, her wonderful little skit about the woman locking the keys to the bedroom and what happens to her husband when she does that. So certainly for slave women, the ability to withstand the kind of sexual harassment that Harriet Jacobs describes here was tragically not very much available. But as a slave woman, she did have, again, a kind of moral high ground. But she could also notice here her freedom to say that she wanted a choice in who she gave her body to. And that's remarkable. That's a stunning thing for any woman, especially a woman writing to powerful middle-class white women to articulate as a means of actually gaining an identification with them.
Jenny Williams notes here the cult was unattainable for both Jacobs and Mrs. Flint. That's an interesting perspective. Would it have been unattainable for Mrs. Flint?
I think so.
Uh-huh.
And Jacob's wonderful description of her is that the doctor's good wife becomes an incredible shrew. She is not submissive. She's passive aggressive to a terrible degree. She can't be pious, and she can't even keep a good home. Dr. Flint had divorced his first wife, and this second Mrs. Flint is scared to death that he'll divorce her too,
Uh-huh.
and that her home becomes a nightmare. And she's a parody of domesticity. The real, of course, model of domesticity in Jacobs's narrative was her grandmother, who managed to hide her for 7 years, who always uses the pious language of domesticity, has tremendous dignity, and is, of course, that primary quality. She is a mother, always a good mother.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so at the let's go ahead and finish this passage. She talks about being flattered. She also knows that it's going to make Dr. Flint angry for her to favor another. Again, a very unusual thing for a woman to admit. Triumph over my tyrant in that small way. And then back in the box, oh, virtuous reader, pity me, pardon me, using that language again. I know I did wrong. But then notice the double standard that she says has to be employed. A slave woman ought not to be judged by the same standard as others. So again, a remarkable shift back and forth between the pious, humble language and the self-assertion that she is absolutely determined to get out there among her reading audience, which she knows is Northern white women of some influence and means. Any other comments about Harriet Jacobs here?
Okay. Any other comments?
Oh, I see one. I see one about men bashing.
Oh, well, that actually relates to a very interesting conversation was developing about the cult of domesticity within a car and whether or not you should tell men if they're going in the wrong direction, that they are in fact going in the wrong direction, or should you just let them discover it on their own? I think we could have a seminar on that topic all by itself. But getting back to Harriet Jacobs, we have a question. To what extent did Jacobs have assistance in writing her book? Good question.
It turns out she had almost none, and for a very long time, actually up to 1970, most historians believe that this book had actually been written by her white friend Lydia Maria Child. But a historian named Jean Fagan Yellen came down here to Raleigh, North Carolina, and worked in history and archives and found documents that showed exactly who everyone was, and then went up and found letters that Jacobs had written to newspapers all through the 1950s and also to abolitionist friends, even a letter she wrote to Harriet Beecher Stowe asking if Stowe would help her get her own narrative published. And Stowe wrote her back and said, well, why don't you just give it to me, and I'm publishing this little anthology of my sources, and I'll just put your story in my book. And Jacobs wrote her back, and we have the letter. No, thank you. I don't want to be in someone else's story. So we do know now almost completely, and there's now a biography of Jacobs written by Jean Fagan Yellen that shows that almost without any question, she wrote this book in every important respect. Lydia Maria Child said that the only thing she did was give suggestions about adding materials or changing the sequencing of things.
We have a question from Jennifer Sullivan. So her use of grammar and the quality of writing is consistent in the letters and the autobiography.
Yes, it is. It's very much the same style. And here's an interesting thing. Jacobs, when she fled to New York, lived in the home of, get this, Fanny Fern, Sarah Martin's brother, Nathaniel Willis, who was a newspaper editor. And Fanny Fern and Harriet Jacobs became very good friends. Fern talks about her in some of her letters and diaries. They visited each other often, and so Jacobs became steeped in an incredibly literate culture, and she knew how to read and write from a very early age. From the age 6 on, she says her mistress had taught her to read. So it's not surprising that she had mastered this vocabulary. She was immersed in it from the time she escaped in the late 1840s.
Right, and I think we ought to note, I expect most people know this, but the setting for Instance Life of a Slave Girl is Edenton, North Carolina, out there in the east.
That's correct, and now you can find some materials. For a long time they didn't want to talk about it, but there's been one important conference there, and now you can visit and identify most of the scenes that she talks about in her narrative.
Yeah, and some of the characters she mentions, when you do the translation and you figure out who they really are, you discover they're buried in the churchyard out there.
Right, and even the home.
Yeah,
the home of her son is you can find the home that her son, that Dr. Flint's son lived in. It's outside of town, but it's still standing.
Yeah. Okay, well then shall we move on?
Yes, we are going to go back to Fanny Fern. Having mentioned her in relationship to Jacobs, I wanted to mention Fanny Fern again because in addition to stories like the one that we read for you, she wrote much harder pitched things as well, including and especially her novel called Ruth Hall. And I wanted to read you this quotation, let it ring in your ears in relationship to the story of how a husband may rule. In this novel, she has this statement. The novel, by the way, is about a woman whose husband abandons her and who has to take to all kinds of drudgery to earn a living before she has the opportunity to become a writer. Actually, it's almost an autobiography of Fanny Fern herself. But here she says there are few people who speak approbatively of a woman who has a smart business talent or capability. No matter how isolated or destitute her condition, the majority would consider it more feminine. Would she unobtrusively gather up her thimble and retiring into some out-of-the-way place, gradually scoop out her coffin with it, than to develop the smart turn for business, which would lift her at once out of her troubles, and which, in a man so situated, would be applauded as exceedingly praiseworthy. This quotation is again about economics and the economic impact of the cult of domesticity on women who did not have the protection of a man who understood his obligations to the cult. And I wanted to include Nathaniel Hawthorne's little comment about Ruth Hall, because remember, he thought most American women writers were scribbling women, that damned tribe of scribbling women, he said. But this is what he wrote to a friend about Ruth Hall. I have been reading Ruth Hall, and I must say I enjoyed it a good deal. The woman writes as if the devil was in her, and that is the only condition under which a woman ever writes anything worth reading. So at least one man greatly appreciated this woman's point of view, but also says she was writing as though the devil was in her. And considering Hawthorne, who at the same time was working on the Scarlet Letter, almost certainly it's a good counterpoint to him. And I think Ruth Hall makes a great novel to read against the Scarlet Letter, which is in so many curricula.
Yeah, Mary points out the power of that image of scooping out your coffin with a thimble.
Yeah.
That really is.
If you read much of Fern, and she's on the web, you can find her newspaper sketches. She had an acid pen. She could really go after things. So the how husbands may rule is such an interesting contrast, and it I think shows how complex this cult was, how many layers we have to dig in order to see how it worked, and how you can't take it at face value, and you can't believe that most of the women who gave lip service to it in all respects. They had an understory that I think it's very useful for students to learn about as well.
Mm-hmm. So then,
the language.
Okay, so that could bring us to the one question from the forum that we really haven't addressed directly yet. I suppose we've been talking about it, but how did the adherence to the cult of domesticity affect women psychologically? How might you sum that up, Cindy?
Well, I think psychologically, it's a very mixed bag. It certainly could play havoc with your sense of self, to see yourself as inferior in all of these respects. Some women saw it as actually their only means of attaining any self-respect, because in the home they could and were expected to do wonders. It also, I think, made women more aware of their own complexity, because certainly there were many moments during their day that they had to either stifle or learn to channel some of the constraints that they were under. So overall, for many women, it became a way to bond with other women around acceptable behaviors, church work, etc., reform to a certain degree. It did create a kind of commonality among women who were able to have some influence over the world simply because of their means, more than anything else. They had time and they had some money to become aware of how to work with other women. And all of those things are psychological factors in how women develop during this period.
Right. And one quick question before we move on to the final slide. Do you have any idea of the percentage of women at this point, mid-19th century, who were without the protection of men? Judith Batten asks.
I don't have figures, but I can only say it was a great many. Mm-hmm. most women, again, it, in the South and North, did not live lives of, of wealth or even ease. And so what this really functions as is more an ideal for most women than a reality. And it was also, of course, an ideal for their husbands. I think this thing worked as a carrot at the end of the stick to move the whole society into a kind of capitalist mode where men could get wealthy if they did the work and create the home as a shrine to their own capacities. And yet the reality was quite different for most women.
Mm-hmm. And here, Jenny Williams asks, was the cult actually an invention of the husbands? Was this something invented by men, or, did women come up with it? What would you point to it as with its origins?
It came, I think, mostly from men. I mean, most of the early work on it came from ministers and also from publishers, interestingly enough, who found a market for these things. Women, if they could have a shot at this, most of them, I think, went along with it. But again, that's a minority, but it's the minority that has the microphone.
Yeah.
It's the minority that gets to determine so many of the values of culture because they simply have the means. But it fit men's agenda, and really even far earlier than the 19th century. One of you mentioned an important historian who has a new book out in your forum, Mary Beth Norton, who has a book called Separated by Their Sex, Women in Public and Private in the Colonial Atlantic World. And she sees this tendency going back even to colonial times, to put women in a box as soon as you could, as a token not of your evil or your greed, but of your promotion of your own sense of self within the state in terms of what was valued and what made you important.
Okay. Well, shall we move on then to the final slide?
Yes, very quickly, because we're about out of time. I just want to mention this, one of my favorite Emily Dickinson poems. Like so many of her poems, it is an attack on the cult of domesticity from a woman who hardly ever left her home. But in this poem, what soft cherubic creatures these gentle women are. One would as soon assault a plush or a pillow or violate a star. Such dimity convictions, a horror so refined of freckled human nature, of deity ashamed. It's such a common glory, a fisherman's degree. Redemption, brittle lady, be so ashamed of thee. So that she is attacking this kind of emphasis on purity and piety in a way that says you gentle women don't deserve redemption because you wouldn't even want to sit down and have dinner with the great fisherman. So I like to show Emily Dickinson, who of course lived during this period as well, as she moves us into a world very close to civil war and to some new attitudes about women that will emerge after the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. And Kristen Thomas notes that Dickinson is an example of a woman who never married, although she really fell under the umbrella of her brother's protection. So to what extent, really was she within the cult of domesticity?
Oh, I think her brother enforced it, and her father, in ways that really most unmarried women had to depend upon. We know that she did have some interesting relationships with other men that made her interested in the whole attitude of women and sex. You see assaulting a plush and violating stars. Those are genteel words for rape. And yet, yes, you had to have male's protection to be acceptable in the town of Amherst, and she certainly had that in her background, but did not like it, I don't believe. Internally, her poems certainly show a chafing against all of that.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our seminar. Let me ask if there are any final questions before we wrap things up. Here we have, how often do we as women think men should protect us? So that we're getting into the question of, does the cult of domesticity still exist in the 21st century? And I think, judging from earlier comments, I think that we can say that it to some extent does. It comes down to us in some ways. What do you think about that, Cindy?
Well, I think that what this cult talks about for us is really the separate spheres for men and women. Is still very much with us, and it's not just politics or economics. It's a psychological thing of our world as well as earlier worlds. That I mean, today a woman was made a brigadier general. But think how unusual that is, and read through the rest of your newspaper and see where, from spousal abuse to who gets hit by poverty most, etc. This split in our thinking between men's and women's spheres is still very much with us today.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you to continue to use the form to continue the discussion. We'll monitor the form until July 15th. Let me remind you that the website that Cindy introduced us to earlier is available through the form. So if you want to get the URL for that and visit that website, just go back to the form. You'll find it there. I want to thank all of you for your participation. You had a lot of really interesting and engaged, enthusiastic comments. I want to thank Cindy for giving us a wonderful seminar. Thank you very much, as always. Please submit your evaluations, and once we get those, if you have not already, if you weren't in our earlier seminar, you will get a stipend check from us for $100. Please keep in mind our regular seminars that we offer during the year. I think you'll find those interesting. And again, thank you for joining us. Now, to escape our online classroom, you go up to the upper left-hand corner where you'll see the word File. Click on that. There's a drop-down menu, and the last item there says Leave the Session. So, again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and have a good day.